When my daughter told me to find another place to die, I packed a single sweater and walked out like I had been sentenced. My name is Helen Morgan. I was married for 42 years, and 3 days after my husband died, I found myself sleeping on a motel bed that smelled of stale smoke and bleach, counting the $27 in my purse like it was a legacy. She stood in the doorway of my bedroom with her arms crossed and a face I did not recognize, and said quietly, "I am tired of supporting you." And that line landed like a verdict. I could have folded. I could have taken the crumbs and lived with the shame. Instead, I remembered the time my husband slid an envelope across the kitchen table and said quietly that he had written the will to protect me. I did not know then that that envelope would become the hinge that swung everything back. Stay with me, because I will show you how betrayal turned into a legal reversal, and how the law, when pressed, can be forced to do more than palliative justice. The funeral smelled of lilies and cheap coffee, and the church hymn book felt like paper armor between me and the world. Anna stood by the casket with Liam, her son, holding her hand, and a woman named Victoria beside them, who smiled in a way that did not reach her eyes. There was Ruth, our neighbor, trying to be discreet with tissues, and Mrs. Benson, the choir leader, nodding as if to say, "I saw it coming." After the burial, Anna said in a tone that was almost practical, "We need to settle Dad's affairs," and she pushed a small stack of paperwork across to me and said, "Your name is just on a few minor things. You know how it is." I stared at the signature line on the inventory list and then at her face and asked, "Is this a joke?" And she said, "No." And that was when Victoria laughed softly, and Liam looked away. The house that I had kept warm for decades felt different. The smell of the wooden banister like old varnish, and the faint perfume of his shirts that still hung in the closet like frozen time. I remember the echo of my voice in the hallway when I said, "Where is the will?" And Anna said, "We will handle it. You can stay with Ruth until things are sorted." I felt each word like a small erasure of the life I had built. The night they changed the locks, my mouth tasted of metal and coffee gone cold. I slept in a motel that had a humming refrigerator and a neon sign that buzzed beyond the thin curtains. The bedspread had a rough texture, and the phone on the nightstand was sticky. The front desk clerk, Carlos, who smelled like cigarette smoke and mint, gave me a paper cup of complimentary coffee and said, low voice, "You look like you need a friend." And I told him no, and then told him everything, and he listened and suggested I see a lawyer. I called Mark Reynolds, the attorney my husband had used for small things, and his voice on the phone was flat, then warm, then professional. He said, "Come in tomorrow at 9 and bring any paperwork you have." I remember sitting on that motel bed with the television playing something that made a laugh track sound oddly distant, and thinking I had to be practical. There was a scrape of traffic outside, and the mattress springs complained when I shifted. Ruth texted me at midnight asking if I was all right, and I typed back, "I am not going to disappear into a coat closet because my child decided I am worthless." Backstory. I grew up in a house where the radio played country songs and my mother ironed shirts until they smelled of starch and lavender. I was the eldest of 3. I learned early how to fix a washer, how to read the fine print on a loan agreement, and how to make a roast stretch for a family of 7. I met Robert at a factory job where he wore a smudged cap and said with a grin, "You will be my wife and I will be your partner." We married young, and the first years were a series of small victories, a rented place becoming ours, a first television replacing the little transistor that sat on the porch. I gave up a budding office career to raise Anna and fund extracurriculars, and between PTA meetings and late-night pie baking, I kept a ledger that balanced expenses like vows to security. When Robert's health declined, I read policies and kept appointments and learned to talk to doctors so they would listen. None of that made me immune to the kind of betrayal that arrives in polite words. I was not helpless, though. I was dismissed as just the wife, and that phrase hung over me like a curtain until I resolved it would not define me. I had a steady hand with numbers because of decades at a small bookkeeping job, and I could smell when an account did not reconcile. After we left the motel, I met Mark in a cramped office whose carpet had that old library smell and whose blinds were bent by sun. Mark unfolded an envelope, and the paper inside had my husband's signature, crisp, and the word will in block letters. He read aloud, and his voice changed when he reached a clause that started with the conditional, "If my wife survives me by 30 days, then," and the room seemed to constrict. Anna boiled over and said that she had been managing the bills, she had been in control. And Mark lifted a finger and asked Anna to sit down, and Anna sat, but did not look at me. There was an exchange there with 10 lines at least that could have been shorter, but I insisted on each word. I said loudly, "Where is the original will?" And Anna said, "We filed everything," and she laughed. And Ruth whispered in my ear, "Just hold on, Helen." And Mark asked, "Do you have any power of attorney?" And I said no, and he said, "Then we will need to petition probate." And he said, "I will call Detective Cruz." And she said, "We can open an inquiry." And Anna said, "You cannot make me." And Victoria said, "Please, enough already." And Liam started to cry. And I felt my heart thudding like a fist against my ribs. The paper had a clause that said Dad had set aside a trust that would transfer upon proof of undue influence, but required a signature from 2 witnesses who had no interest in the estate. That clause smelled like a hinge. I decided to investigate because indignation curdles into action if you let it. I visited the bank with Mark, and the bank manager was brusque until Mark used a phrase, "reserve authority," and suddenly he became helpful. The branch smelled of polished wood and coffee, and the folders were cool under the fluorescent lights. We requested account statements. The bank froze certain transactions, and the teller named Jamie went to the vault and returned with a stack of checks that had been written in the weeks before the funeral. The handwriting had similarities, and a forensics accountant named Dr. Mason would later say those signatures contained patterns of forgery. On the street, Detective Elena Cruz met me with a clipboard and said, "We will need to interview everyone present at the signing." She had a dry tone and a backpack of evidence bags and a sharp gaze that noticed details like the smell of cigarette smoke on a scarf. That night at my small apartment, I lay awake and thought of the old ledger and how numbers do not lie unless they are reshaped. The revelation came when Mark called me at lunch with a voice that was equal parts relief and restrained excitement. He said, "You need to come now." And I put on a cardigan that smelled of my detergent and went to his office feeling like I was walking in slow water. He laid out an affidavit that had been filed in secret and said there was a conditional clause in the will that protected me if certain conditions were met. Anna had interpreted procedure as permission to act and had used a temporary guardianship process to remove me from the house. Mark read the clause aloud, and each word landed heavier than the last. If my wife is found to be of sound mind and not under undue influence, and if 2 independent witnesses confirm the testamentary capacity, then distribution shall follow. I realized then that Dad had been careful. He had anticipated family frictions and had left a legal scalpel. Anna tried to interrupt with 10 of her own barbed comments, and Victoria whispered to Liam, but Mark asked for evidence, and Detective Cruz arrived while I was still reeling, and she said quietly, "We can freeze accounts and place holds, but we need to document fraud." The plan emergent was surgical. We would gather witness testimony, subpoena records, and bring in a forensic accountant to analyze transfers. Technical aside, the process we used to freeze assets and contest the probate involved petitioning the court for emergency injunctions and submitting a forensics report. The bank placed a temporary hold on accounts, and the prosecutor opened an inquiry to determine whether forged signatures or undue influence occurred. Forensic accounting is the method of tracking financial flows and matching handwriting patterns with known samples, and that disciplined paperwork later tied transactions to Anna's management. The operation began with small acts that smelled of laundry soap and determination. Ruth drove me to appointments and handed me a sandwich that tasted like home. Mrs. Benson came to court and testified about how Anna had been impatient about selling things. She said, "I saw her packing his watch into a box, and that was a small sound in the room, but it shifted perception." At a deposition, Liam was asked about his mother's behavior, and he mumbled, "I did not want to move," and that landed like a weathered stone. We gathered 10 witness statements and a trail of transfers to a shell company that bore Victoria's signature. The first arrests were careful. They were not dramatic like television, but they were precise. Detective crews coordinated with Special Agent Hayes from the federal office, who had a patient voice and a badge that glinted under fluorescent lights. There was a sting where we recorded conversations, and conversations require back and forth, so we staged a meeting where Anna expected to finalize the sale, and instead she met someone she thought was a buyer, but who was an undercover. The dialogue there was long, and it unfolded with 11 exchanges, and each exchange tightened the net. I listened from a car outside while my hands smelled of lemon disinfectant and my pulse tapped in my throat, and when Anna said, "You always think you deserve better," the voice answered calm, "You can sign now." And Anna did, and the signatures matched. Moment of tension 1. The first time the locks changed, I stood on the porch with a shopping bag of my things, and Anna said quietly, "You know you cannot stay here." And I said, "Where am I supposed to go?" And she said, "Any place but here." And my voice cracked, and I said, "For 42 years." And she said, "It was not enough." The air tasted metallic with rain, and the wood of the porch was slick, and my knees wanted to buckle. I heard the neighbors' radio through a screen and smelled frying oil, and the moment stretched like an elastic band. Moment of tension 2 in Mark's office when the clause was read. Anna rose like a flame and said, "You cannot use his careful words against me." And Mark said, "I am not using anything. I am reading his explicit instruction." And Anna slammed her hand on the table, and papers flew, and the fluorescent light hummed, and for a second I thought violence might happen. The room smelled of paper and old coffee, and Detective Crew's shoes clicked in the corridor, and that sound carried weight. Moment of tension 3, the deposition with Liam. When he was asked who packed Dad's shirts, he looked down at his shoes and said, "My mother told me to take them." And his voice was thin, and the recorder kicked it up, and I felt both relief and sorrow because a child had been pressed into choosing sides. Moment of tension 4, the arrest at the dinner where Anna had planned a celebration. The air in the dining room was warm with roast and candles, and people laughed, and then agents moved in, and the sound of cuffs closing was loud and absolute, and I smelled roasted garlic and new leather and a kind of public humiliation that felt like justice served cold. Throughout this, I named people who acted and reacted. Anna, my daughter, who orchestrated the exclusion. Victoria, her partner, who signed with a careful hand. Liam, my grandson, who clung to pieces of truth. Mark Reynolds, the lawyer who read the will and pushed for injunctions. Detective Elena Cruz, who organized witness statements. Special Agent Hayes, the federal agent who coordinated the sting. Carlos at the motel, who handed me coffee. And Jamie, the teller who pulled files. And Dr. Mason, the forensic accountant who traced transfers. Each of them did something specific, Carlos let me use his phone when I had no minutes. Jamie found a check that did not belong. Dr. Mason highlighted patterns, and Detective Cruz compiled statements, and Special Agent Hayes arranged the undercover operation that captured the confession. We ran into offers to settle the day before trial, and there were murmurs of pressure and blackmail offers aimed at keeping Anna silent. One person called a friend and said, "We can make this go away for the right price," and I was offered a sum of money to drop the suit. I remember holding the offer in my palm and thinking of the ledger of my life and of Robert's steady hand, and I said no. Mark warned me that accepting would end the case and likely mean a lesser recovery and perhaps no accountability. I thought of the message that punishment sometimes does not repair, and yet without it, others are left vulnerable. I thought also of the child who had been taught that family is negotiable. The final operation felt cinematic only because it had been choreographed with the patience of procedural law and the grit of small minds at work. We recorded conversations with consent and without, because law allows certain recordings if one party believes wrongdoing will occur. And the undercover engaged Anna with offers to launder funds, and Anna explained how she had manipulated guardianship papers in a sequence that sounded practiced. The FBI arrived with measured steps and read rights, and those words have their own heavy music. "You are under arrest," and the room went very quiet. Anna looked at me, and for a heartbeat, I saw the old girl who had learned to mimic soft smiles, but then steeled herself. In court, wiring by Dr. Mason was presented, and handwriting analysis showed forgery patterns, and the judge, who had a voice like gravel, issued rulings that made funds revert and set sentences that would be counted in months. The courtroom smelled of old varnish and cheap cologne, and the public gallery had cameras from the local news which flashed like insects. The prosecutor Elaine, who had a reputation for leaning on evidence, stood and presented a timeline that matched transaction with action, and when she said undue influence, the room took a collective breath. During testimony, Anna tried to spin stories, and Victoria mouthed words at the back, and Liam gave a statement about seeing checks signed, and his small voice held its own in the legal theater. The jury deliberated, and when the verdict came, I felt both relief and a hollow place where years had been chewed away. They were convicted on counts of fraud, forgery, and undue influence, and the court ordered restitution and a sentence that required them to forfeit ill-gotten gains. 1 month later, I found myself signing paperwork in a small conference room where sunlight made a rectangle on the table, and Mark said, "You did it," and I could not say I had done it alone. I had supporters. Ruth had organized a meal train, and Mrs. Benson had come to every hearing, and even Carlos popped in to say hello. The house was unlocked for the first time in weeks, and I stepped over threshold, and the smell of old varnish and his shirts was both comfort and grief. I had to decide about forgiveness and what that word meant when trust had been broken. I started the small process of reclaiming objects that mattered, photographs that had been misplaced, and letters that had been hidden. People in town came forward to say we had suspected things and asked for advice on guardianship and power of attorney, and I began to speak at a church meeting about clear documents and safeguards. The money that was returned was not a miracle cure, but it allowed me to hire a trustee to manage funds properly and set up a small trust for Liam's schooling. 3 months later, the trial had settled, the criminal pieces, and a civil suit secured. Restitution that paid off pressing debts and created a modest cushion. I started to work with an elder rights group and met with a social worker named Angela who helped me navigate elder protections. I found myself volunteering at a hotline where I could tell callers how to spot the signs of undue influence, how to request account statements, and how to set up independent checks. The community reaction was mixed. Some praised my persistence. Others whispered about family disputes. But many called to say your story helped me ask questions. I wrote a statement for a local paper that went online, and the comment section held stories of similar betrayals, and that was both devastating and cathartic. I thought about Anna and the path that had led her to decisions that cost her freedom, and I tried to hold space for the complexity of human failing without excusing the harm. 6 months on, the house felt like a lived-in thing again, with small repairs, and the carpet had been cleaned, and the smell of lemon cleaner lingered. I started a modest foundation in Robert's name to help seniors navigate wills and guardianship documents and to fund forensic accounting consultations for low-income families. The foundation was small and it felt right because it turned a wound into a guardrail for others. Liam visited more often, and we sat on the back porch and learned to make a proper pie, and he no longer flinched at raised voices. I sometimes walked past the courthouse and remembered how heavy words like conviction and restitution had sounded, and how they had finally spelled out a kind of justice. I am not gullible. I am older, but that age gave me a bitter kind of wisdom. It taught me that dignity is not the exclusive property of youth or blood, and that sometimes the law can be a tool of repair. If you were in my shoes, how would you have reacted to being pushed out by someone you raised? Take a moment and tell me in the comments. Start with, in my case, and share the most cruel family thing you witnessed. Your words matter and help build a community that understands this is not only my story and not unique. Your comments help others feel less alone and guide us when we make videos about prevention and legal steps. Now, back to the story. I want to remind you that when anger became fuel, I sought counsel, and that is the turning point where a private hurt became public accountability. In closing, I did not end up rich. I gained restitution and my name back, and a network of people who said elder rights matter. They were convicted, the frozen accounts were reversed, and a trust was established with oversight. I thought often about forgiveness and decided that I would not spend my energy on revenge, but on structures that protect others. Family is a promise, not a warranty. And when that promise is broken, the law can be an instrument not of vengeance, but of boundary. If you found any part of the story resonant, subscribe to follow similar cases where justice required stubbornness and paperwork and a small band of principled people. Share this video with someone who needs to know that a will can be more than paper and that careful clauses and witnesses can matter. Remember the line I kept repeating to myself? You are not just the wife, you are a person. And that simple assertion carried me from a motel bed to a courtroom and into a room where the consequences fit the crime.